as soon as we're live.
Yeah.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you everyone for joining us. Good evening and welcome to the first in our webinar series, which is brought to you by Imagining Otherwise, which is part of Changing the Story. It's an arts-based, youth-focused research project in collaboration with Bottom Up and the Chisimani Center for Activist Education. Today's topic is Disposable Youth, how society treats youth in urban townships and rural villages. Welcome again. I'm Dr. Alwyn Walsh, Associate Professor in Performance and Social Change based at the University of Leeds, and I'm delighted to work in partnership with these two fantastic organizations with social justice at the forefront of their practice. The seminar series is supported by the University of Leeds, and our wider project is funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund. In the project, we work with artists as well as learners from the Cape Flats to engage with how we can make sense of spatial inequalities and use stories to speak out about their lives and what they feel needs to change. For that, we need to explore some of these big ideas and how they play out in everyday life. Just a wider note that in our online world, everything is a little compartmentalized. And so the series topics are not trying to do everything at once. We'd be delighted if you wanted to follow the project updates on social media, and we look forward to sharing what the young people produce in due course. I'll now hand over to Ashley for the introduction to our esteemed speakers and a little bit more about how the session will proceed. Enjoy.
Thank you, Alwyn. So there are three pivotal concepts for the series, and those are reproduction, reimagination, and resistance. And when we talk about resistance, it's also important to know what precisely are we resisting or trying to resist. And this evening, our two speakers will bring to bear history and sociology in an effort to analyze the political terrain of education and youth. We begin by looking back to help us understand how we arrived in this present moment, and with the aim of being able to think through what is happening now, as well as with a view to looking forward. So it's a real honor for me to introduce our two speakers, Heather and Nazim. I know them as my academic supervisors, Heather for my master's and Nazim for my PhD, which I've just embarked on. So Azeem's intellectual interest is in youth, race, and criminalization in South Africa, looking specifically at youth socialization in residential settings in South Africa. This evening, Azeem will take us through his PhD study, which is called Ottery School of Industries. And we look back at that study, asking how it's relevant for now in terms of how youth are being positioned and marginalized in policy discourse. For Heather, she is a retired senior lecturer from the UCT School of Education. Her research interests relate to understanding teaching as a practice and social justice implications of practices within the field of education. And this evening we look at work which Heather has done in rural education and Bantustan schooling. And it was part of a set of reports that were written in 1994, which Heather's recently looked back at as part of a research palimpsest that's going back and looking what's changed, what stayed the same, why is that the case, and what can we learn from that in terms of how policy works. So our format for tonight is going to be Azeem will be up first. We'll give them 20 to 30 minutes, followed by Heather. And then I will pose some questions, and we will have some questions also from the viewers. So Azeem, over to you.
Thanks, Ashley. If you could put up the PowerPoint, if you don't mind. Well, not the PowerPoint, these strange new ways of doing things, using Google Docs live. Let me introduce myself first. When Ashley spoke to me about telling a story about youth in the urban, it was largely you asking me to tell the story of my life, which is a very difficult thing, especially in 30 minutes. So part of what I was challenged to do was to think through how I would see my life into 30 minutes in terms of working with youth on the Cape Flats. So let me try to do some of that. What I wanted to try to do firstly is to show you a video of the institution that I've been working with for the past 25 years. Way back when I was a master's student, I drove around Cape Town looking for a way of engaging with the story of youth on the Cape Flats. And in doing so, I came across an institution in Ottery, which is just borders Parkwood and Grossie Park on the Cape Flats. And it's an institution that was started in 1948. So I want to tell a bit of the story of Ottery. And I thought the best way to tell the story of Ottery was to give you a recent video that we created at Ottery in order to promote the school, but more to promote the needs of the young learners at the school. So the picture I chose, if I may just start off with the two front pictures, two seminal images in my leading slide there, and that is the one is the Bible. And what part of the story I want to tell is the importance of religion and the Bible in how we think about urban youth, and how we think about their needs, and how we try to punish them in the modern state. The second picture, I should say, that picture was taken in 1995, and Ottery has changed quite a bit. We do provide a lot more services than we provided then. But I did want to show you this scant kind of service that boys in residential care get in South Africa. But I thought let's move to if we can, Ashley. I know we tried before, and the video may not have sound, but let's try to go to the video on the third slide. I'm not sure Ashley's there.
I will try to put the video on for you. Just 1 second, Azeem.
Sure.
It may or may not have sound. We'll see how that goes.
Not a problem. Do I speak while the video is playing, or does it work separately? Okay. Ashley?
Yeah. I don't think the sound of the video is going to be
Fine,
working.
no problem.
Sure.
Would the people be able to hear me while the video plays?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
You're live.
Let me speak to the video. The main thing about the video, and I think the sound does make a difference. Actually, if you don't mind, if we could go to the start of it, and I'll be able to speak to it as a way of introducing the institution. And people can then watch the video as. Are you able to go back?
I'll do so.
Okay, sorry. Okay. Now, Ottery is it's in Plantation Road, just outside Parkwood. Scenes that you see is scenes of Parkwood and some of Hanover Park as well. Ottery is in the past it was called a school of industry. It's currently called a youth care center, and we take in kids from the children's court that are deemed to be in need of care. These are kids that are either orphans, they've been neglected at home, they maladjusted, or they have committed small crimes, small misdemeanors that then get them caught up in the youth justice system, and they are then sent to Ottery. This is the principal of Ottery, Mo Muhadik. In that scene, he's at the breakfast table, and Mo goes to Ottery every morning at 6 a.m. to have breakfast with his boys. If the audience, you can follow the story that is being told via the subtitles. Mo has been at the institution since 1987. So he's been there for what, 33 years. And started out as an educational psychologist. And at the moment, since 2010, he's been the principal of the institution. The institution was established in 1948. It's a twist of fate that Ottery was opened in the very year that apartheid formally came into being. So it's just a coincidence that the date. It was established in 1948 on what we would call a airfield on the Cape Flats, and it was initially deemed to be an unsuitable site because it's the flats, and so it was the marshes basically. But it's built on about 67 hectares of land, and was set up in the 1940s and 50s to house up to 1,000 boys. And I'll come back to the story, but it was established specifically for colored boys. So it's about 1,000 boys, and in the period 1948 till 1990, that institution has more or less served an annual number of boys to the tune of about 600 to 700 boys. In 1990, leading into 1994, the school that was a national competence was moved to a provincial competence. And with that, the provincial government decided they didn't want to pay for boys coming from the rest of the country. And therefore, that number has dropped since. And at the moment, we serve between 70 to 100 boys. I won't say annually because they stay for as long as we feel we need to keep them. I say this in terms of we keep them. I've been tied to the institution for the past 25 years. I initially started off as a master's student. I then carried on into a PhD, and I've been associated with the institution ever since. There's a nice picture there of Prince Harry. He visited the institution in about 2015. And we did some dancing with him as well. Anyway, I'll get back to that story. Okay, so why am I telling the story? I'm telling the story of neglect. What you see on the screen is an institution that serves boys that have been neglected, not only in the current period, but their parents and their grandparents were similar kinds of boys that were neglected under the old system. These boys lived in the theater of the urban. And myself and Mo and a few others have been working with these boys, trying to create a different kind of system that does not punish young boys, but provides them with the skills and the tools to go out into the world and make something of themselves. Mo, at the end of this video, and what's very important, why I wanted sound, Mo at the end of the video looks up and he tells the story here, and how do we treat our children as if they're children, and then takes a big gulp and then asks the question how we can treat these kids as children of a lesser God. Now, fundamentally, Ashley asked me to speak to you, to speak about youth, and youth in the urban, and the problem when we start speaking about youth in the urban space is that we often speak about youth in the now. We speak about them in relation to how they're situated in a position in the present neoliberal and global world. We look for the parallel imaginaries at the societal, policy, local, institutional, and individual levels. And then we try to connect and inform a particular kind of world that we'd like youth to be experiencing. But for me, what my big problem always when I have to engage with the story about these kinds of institutions, the questions I ask is what has led to these current disarticulations between society, policy, institution, and subject that has created such a surreal, spectral, contrived, ambivalent, and absurd experience for young boys living on the Cape Flats. Not only in where they live and the kinds of educational experiences that they get, but that when they are found to be maladjusted or found to be struggling, that they are then placed into institutions that treat them in very surreal ways. And so maybe that's partly where I need to go back to history. I want to tell the story about Ottery. Ottery is founded in 1948 on the back of a reformatory that had been established in Cape Town, in just above Tokai Forest. It was called the Porter Reformatory. It was established in the 1880s for young delinquent youth in Cape Town, and it was for all youth that were delinquent. And the Governor General at the time, William Porter, felt that we needed a facility whereby kids could be removed from their homes and placed in an institution where they could be provided with a safe space, but also a place where they could get education and where they could get access to some kind of learning about manual work that could then allow them to return and take a proper place in society. I'm not going to give you a whole long story about Porter, but the essential point is that Porter was closed in 1990. So it had a lifespan of just more than 110 years. Actually, sorry, not 1990, 1999. But importantly, in the 1920s, Porter was broken off into different kinds of institutions. It was felt that Porter needed to serve only colored boys, and subsequently they built Constantia Reformatory for girls and Constantia Reformatory for boys. Now you will, as a contemporary audience, you will know Constantia Reformatory for boys is currently the Cape Academy. Cape Academy is built on that ground, and the international school, the American International School, is built on, not built on, they took over the buildings, on the Constantia Reformatory for girls. Those two were split off in the 1920s for white delinquent boys and girls. Ottery was set up in 1948 because it was felt that colored boys until the 1948 had been stigmatized by delinquency, by criminality, that many boys that were entering Porter Reformatory were not criminals in any kind of way. Many of them had stolen apples, had done various delinquent small misdemeanors, hit another child, been uncontrollable in school and things like that, and they were being sent to Porter Reformatory. And the United Party at the time felt that they needed a institution that that did not treat the kids necessarily as criminals. So it was they broke the system itself broke up into a juvenile justice system and a childcare system. And under the childcare system, Ottery was established in that vacuum. The idea, though, was that Ottery would serve boys that were mostly maladjusted. Now, in terms of what boys, it was colored boys, but it was not only colored boys, it was colored boys from across the country. It was colored boys from Cape Town, colored boys from the rural areas, colored boys from Port Elizabeth, from Johannesburg, from Durban, from Limpopo, and here's the thing, from Uganda, from Zimbabwe, from Malawi, and as far away as Kenya as well. What we must remind ourselves is that we were a British colony at the time, and as a British colony, it was felt that all colored boys needed to know more about themselves and to operate in relation to each other so that they could learn how to command respect as a colored community, as a colored population that needed to be rehabilitated. And so part of the whole structure of our youth care and juvenile justice system was built around this notion not only of rehabilitation, but rehabilitating race itself. And Ottery was one of the institutions that rehabilitated colored boys. You also had institutions in the 1950s that were built for colored girls. You had institutions, as I noted, for reformatories and schools of interest for white girls and boys. And then the argument at the time in the 1930s and 40s was that African native kids could not be reformed, and there was no point in reforming them, and therefore no institutions were ever set up for them. The argument simply was that you put them in hostels, you made them find work where they go out to work and come home to the hostels, or you put them in the reformatories itself. And so Diepkloof Reformatory in Soweto was the key institution for African boys. There was never any institution up till today for African girls. So what we have under in the theater of the urban in South Africa, historically, is a construction of a juvenile justice and childcare system that is fundamentally racialized from its outset. Why would I want to note that? I want to note that because we need to move, and I know I'm running out of time very quickly. As I said, I wanted to tell the entire story. Actually, I'm not sure where we are on the slides.
You have 5 more minutes, Azeem, or
I do.
10 if you like.
Yeah. So coming back to the story, why would you want to know more about the child, youth, and justice system? Mainly because that in understanding how the child and youth care system operated in South Africa and how it emerged in South Africa, we get insight into the lives of youth, racialized youth, that was seen as living on the periphery, the marginalized youth. And they have very different ways of engaging with the modern state system. Firstly, white kids that committed crimes and that were delinquent in any kind of way, was seen as the worst of the worst. So ironically, white kids, of all the kids that were under apartheid, that were ever placed in residential care, were treated the worst. They were embarrassment to the white race. And so when they were institutionalized, they were treated to really brutal environments. But they were seen as the truly marginalized and living on the periphery. The other white kids, when the state needed to identify why or whether the child was coping or not, whether the child was disciplined in classroom or not, they would use the teacher to identify which kids were the problem kids, and then they set up alongside that. They set up an entire system of career guidance and child guidance clinics that the teacher then sent white kids to. So in South Africa, we have an entire child guidance system that was built around the needs of white kids in schools that should not go to reformatories and schools of industries, but needed to be saved. And the child guidance system in South Africa was built around that for them. Child guidance clinics were only set up for white kids, really, and later on for colored kids. For Indian kids, the population has always been very small. So there's only one school of industry for Indian kids that was built in Newcastle. But it was always seen that the Indian community, and this is very racialized world that we live in, the Indian kids are more familial. That families tend to look after Indian kids, and so it was felt that they did not need institutions for Indian kids. For colored kids, the argument was that teachers were too emotional, and teachers were too they were too bound up to they were too emotionally connected to their kids. And so from the 1940s onwards, as the modern state developed these mechanisms to deal with kids in our various schools, what they set up was they set up a team of specialists, white specialists, that went to every colored school and went to find out which kids needed to be committed to an institution and which kids should be sent elsewhere. And then African kids, it was felt that African kids should not be in the city in the first place, and if they were, they could be institutionalized in colored institutions. But if they came from the rural areas, the idea was that the way in which to identify colored delinquent kids was to have the chief in the various homelands identify which kids were problems, and then walk from the homeland to the places like Port Elizabeth. And then in Port Elizabeth, they would go to the magistrate and write affidavits about what the problem was with the kid. And then the magistrate would then determine where that kid would go. So in the history of South Africa, not only do we have a child care system that was dealing with marginalized youth in very particular ways, in very racialized ways, but also develop narratives about how their lives would be constructed when they entered the institutions of the state. White kids went to clinics, colored kids went to reformatories and schools of industries, African kids went to hostels and prisons. White kids were identified by teachers, and teachers played a fundamental role in their development. Colored kids had a team of specialist psychologists and various others coming and making determinations about the well-being or whatever. And African kids was determined by magistrates what their needs were. And so what we have in the theater of the urban is a set of narratives and vocabularies that frame how marginalization itself is understood. And if people tell me today that there isn't an issue of race, I always remind them that you can take race away, but the engagement, the institutional arrangements that was created under apartheid that framed how marginalization was dealt with through social services of variety, whether it be education, welfare, correctional services, the childcare courts, the children's courts, all of those were racialized. And those services have never been unraveled since 1994. Last few points. We do live in extremely troubled times. We have non-functional economies. We have massive unemployment. Poverty is rife. Climate change is an issue. Ecological disasters, global warming, religious, national conflict. And then we have COVID. And we have the Black Lives Matter movement that is not that is speaking to a particular thing, and that is racism and the constant harassment, oppression, and killing of Black populations across the world. The question is, when people have these debates about racism and race and marginalization, they don't quite grapple with what the actual problem is. We can offer, as sociologists, historians, and anthropologists, various kinds of diagnoses. But what we're also trying all the time is to provide insights that help us think about youth living in a better future. Because children are the future of our world, and it's the struggle for their survival that has always been entangled in our struggles for our futures. So our conception of youth then is rooted in the idea that we will always be there and committed to ensuring a world in which they can be protected and empowered. And there's a social contract between the state, adults, and youth that we always going to see to their needs. But we cannot if we don't have public institutions, because it's only public institutions really that have been serving any level of marginalized kids in a meaningful way over more than 100 years. The problem is that all our images and our representations and the values we speak to and the vocabularies that we regularly call up, they speak to public institutions and public services in a very, very particular way. So as I close off, I've got various pictures that I'm hoping that Ashley was showing you. Ashley, if you can just go through the slides quickly. And then I did have one last video that I wanted to show right at the end, but I doubt that if the sound was not working, I doubt that video will work. Actually, it's the very last slide. If I can just show that video. You're not going to probably, these are just images of colored kids as a way of showing you the kinds of the world of the colored kid that is tied to criminality, that is tied to vocational education. But what I wanted to show here in the last video was what we have been doing over the past 10 years since Mo took over as principal of Otri. As a researcher, I worked with Mo, and then we decided we're going to start doing a number of interventions and try to find ways of building up the institution in a different way. And what we did was we got funding from the EMS Foundation. It's a foundation that strange way in which we got the money in the first place. Mrs. Stein drove past the institution one day and came inside and said, "What kind of institution are you running?" And Mo sat down with her and said, "Well, we serve young, vulnerable boys, and this is what we do." And she said, "Well, how would you like it if I went out and fundraised for you?" And we said, "Fine, we're a poor institution. Anybody that's willing to do anything for us, we'll take whatever help we can get." And a year later, she turned up with 250,000. And it's from that 250,000 that we then developed the relationship with the IMS Foundation. But in doing that, what we also did was we used the money to restructure our entire system, residential care system. So we set up homes in the institution. For instance, we have kids, and this is a very touching moment for me in terms of what we serve. We had one incident last year where a boy was transferred from Horizon, Pusasa Horizon. It's a youth care center out in the rural area, and he had been held at the Horizon for about 2 years, and he came to R3 because he had been abused there, and he laid a complaint, and the magistrate then moved him to us, knowing that we approach kids in very different ways. And on his first day there, he came in and he said to Sali that he hadn't seen his parents for 2 years. Sali then phoned me, and he phoned Mo and said, listen here, I've got this boy and he hasn't seen his parents for 2 years. They live in Beaufort West. I'd like to take him to Beaufort West and go and meet his parents. We couldn't refuse, so Sali got into his car, drove up to Beaufort West. The boy basically spent about 2 hours with his parents, and then he came back. The point is that we develop a very different system of care for delinquent kids nowadays in the kinds of institutions. And so what we do nowadays, when we saw that incident, we felt that we would use the money to create hope, like a visiting home. And at the moment, on a weekly basis, we have one family coming to live in the home and meet and joining up with their kids, spending the weekend in that home on the institution, and then they would go off, and the next week another set of parents would come. As you can see, these are very, very marginalized communities. One mother came up to me and hugged me one day at one of our fairs and said, thank you so much for keeping my boy here. And I said, why would you want your child to be held in a residential care institution while he can be with you at home? And she says, come to my door. Every morning I go out into my front garden, and I pick up the bullets that lie in my front garden. I need my child to be protected from that. And being here at R3, yes, it's a delinquent institution for supposedly delinquent kids, but here he's protected. And she cried in my arms. And it's those moments that make us understand that marginalization is not about a service. It's not about how we think about vulnerability in these very academic ways. That vulnerability goes far deeper. It goes to the bodies of human beings, and it goes to their histories, and it goes to the ways in which systems have been set up to deal with the bodies of different groups, and how those institutions have dealt with their histories. And when we deal with them today, when we think about schools on the flats that can't open at the moment, that the minister speaks about, well, we must commend schools that have tried their best to set themselves up to reopen. We must commend them. And for all those schools on the flats that have not tried to do that, and insinuating that the teachers are lazy and that they don't want to be working, that's their fault. That's a vocabulary and a way of thinking about marginalized kids on the Cape Flats that goes back a century. And I think maybe on that note, I want to stop, and I'll get into the discussion later on. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Azeem. So we've heard a lot about the public, the private, about the marginalization of youth, and about the different ways in which black youth and white youth are engaged through major social institutions like education and care services in society. We want to pick up more on that in the question and answer session after Heather presents. But I would like to put it to those who are viewing. Thank you for joining us. And if you have questions for Azeem, if you would please post that into the comment section so that we could pick up on that later on. For now, we're going to move over to Heather and her presentation.
Hi, everyone. I've been listening, obviously, with great interest to Azeem's presentation and thinking about what the connections and parallels are between the two. And in fact, I think I've been surprised at how strong those parallels are. For example, I jotted down a few words that Azeem said. He said, it's about the institutional arrangements that framed the experiences of youth and that have never been unraveled. Well, that is about as good a way as summarizing what my talk is going to be about as any. Azeem's talk had a lot of lovely rich color, which comes from viewing a story from the inside, whereas mine is going to be much more from the outside. And so I have been sitting here thinking, I wish I'd thought to bring with me a small apron that I've kept for over 40 years. And it's an apron that was sewn by a 10-year-old girl as part of a standard school project that all the 10-year-old girls, all the, what was then called standard 5 girls in that school did. They did the project of making an apron. And when I asked the teacher why it was an apron they had to make, she said, well, there will probably be domestic workers one day and they will need aprons. I found that very moving at the time. I still do. I think it speaks to so much about the way in which the lives of those children were and still are constrained and imagined. And as I say, one of these aprons was given to me, and I still remind myself often of what I think it means. So I'm going to assume as I speak that there's a particular audience. Of course, that audience will be very wide and diverse, but I'm going to assume that the most important subgroup within that audience are young people. I hope I'm correct in that assumption, because I prepared this talk thinking in that way. I'm also going to assume that many of those young people, many of you who are listening, are young people who have been to or currently in urban schools, and so perhaps are not so familiar with the kind of schools that I'm talking about. And I'm also going to assume that your reason, perhaps, for attending this or watching this is because you want to think about the schools that you are in, and you're looking for tools for doing that. And perhaps I would suggest that such a tool is to think about the system more broadly, about history, going back further, and then to come back to your schools and to ask where your schools and your experiences fit into that. And I think the key question then becomes, why are our schools so different from each other? Why are our experiences so different from those of each other? And this COVID moment, I think, has really torn open the curtain that reveals just how different these experiences are, and these schools are, and the opportunities that they frame for people in them, how different these are. And I think we need a way to think about these differences. So people keep asking. In fact, recently I wrote something about whether or not schools, about schools reopening or not reopening. And after I wrote that, people said to me, but you didn't say whether you think the schools should open or not. And I said, because I think that's perhaps the wrong question. If the schools reopen, certain people will suffer and others won't. If the schools don't reopen, the same people will suffer and the same won't. So for me, in a way, that's not the biggest question, although of course it is a huge practical issue and we do have to take positions on it. But for me, the questions behind that is, why are some schools safer than others? Why are schools so different? How did this come about? And then most importantly, and I think this is why this session has been set up, what needs to change so that all schools can be safe, can be places where learners can, where young people can succeed and learn and thrive. So I think that is the question. What needs to change? I think COVID has pushed that question right up against our noses. And I think in order to think about that question, we need to think about how we got here as well. So that's a little bit about where I'm coming from in the topic. And as with Azeem, as Azeem suggested in some ways, I think how we got here is partly about history. And well, there are many layers to this history. Two important layers are the South African story and the story of all countries. And I think ultimately we always have to think of both of these together. We have to think about why there are such strong connections and similarities across many countries. But that's not what I'm going to talk about here. I'm going to talk about the South African story. And this is a story about our inequalities that have been built into the system that we still have today. Another story that I often go back to because it reminds me of big lessons that are easy to forget is, and I promise you I'll soon get to the focus on Bantustan schools. But before I get there, I want to go further back to the story of the first modern type schools in this country. And I use the phrase modern type because they were certainly not the first ways in which education was provided in this country, but they were first schools of a certain type, and the type that in many ways are still familiar to us today. And they were the schools that were provided for young slaves, not children of slaves, although they were in fact brought to this country, to what was then the Cape Colony, as slaves. And the purpose of those schools was to teach them to be better slaves. The young slaves that were brought to the Cape Colony were too young and didn't have the skills that the slave owners thought they should have. And so a school was established to teach young slaves to be better slaves. I think if we ever forget that the purposes of schooling are defined by those who control them, that story reminds us. But of course, as many of you will know, slaves went and turned much of the experiences in some of those schools later to their own advantage. They contested what went on in those schools, often guided by intellectuals in their own circles, which at that time were often religious intellectuals. So I think that little vignette reminds us to think about very particular questions about schools, who controls them, how are they contested, what are they actually for? So skip forward nearly 300 years to 1948 in order to get to the story of the Bantustans, which is my focus. By then, schooling had been organized largely according to both place and race. Even though schooling was largely insufficient for Black people, for Black children, there were inadequate numbers of schools. The quality of schooling was generally not good compared to the quality of schools for whites, but already the spatial arrangements were in place. Schools were built where people lived, where people lived were already in townships and in what then were called reserves. So we already had space and race and class working together even before the Bantustans were introduced. But once the apartheid government came into place, one of the biggest strategies they used to embed much more deeply and much more strongly this race, class, place arrangement in schooling was to introduce Bantustans. That is, areas of land that were designated for people who, in a very loose sense, were identified according to the languages they spoke, and who were then declared to be separate nations by the government of the time. Now, the main point I want to make here is that the way schooling was provided in these Bantustans has put in place a whole lot of arrangements that, and I borrow Azeem's words, have still not unraveled. And these arrangements are to do with race, class, and place and geography. And I want to suggest that the key arrangement that was used was the way schools were financed. With very few exceptions of schools that were in towns within the Bantustans, schools were financed according to a system that can be called state-aided. I'd like you to hold on to that phrase because it didn't end with the end of apartheid. What state-aided meant was that the state, especially the central state in this case, provided money for teachers' salaries indirectly and for nothing else, not for school buildings. These were paid for by parents. And we're talking about parents in the poorest and most rural areas who could least afford to do that. The land the schools were built on was set aside by traditional authorities. So this set of arrangements about the way schools were financed shaped what schools looked like and what happened in schools in really complicated ways. First of all, it shaped and affected what the number of schools and classrooms were that were built. So there were very seldom sufficient schools and sufficient classrooms, simply because poor parents could not scratch together enough money to build sufficient schools and sufficient classrooms. And sufficient everything that went with schools, for example, toilets. This way of providing schools also meant that class sizes were very big, but more particularly in some areas than others and in some grades and at some levels. But in cases, there were class groups. There were areas where class groups of over 100 were not unusual. In fact, there was in the Transkei at one point, for a particular sector of the schools, the average number of students per formal class, yes, there were things called informal classrooms, buildings, but properly provided formal classes was 192 kids per class. So there were simply too few schools and too few classrooms because parents were needing to build these. And then the central government at some point said, we're not going to pay the salaries of teachers who don't have classrooms, because if they don't have classrooms, they're not likely to be teaching. And so they started limiting the number of teachers that they paid for salaries they paid because of the limited number of classrooms. And because in schools, especially in the secondary schools, because there were very few classrooms, it was very difficult to offer a whole wide range of subjects and to subdivide class groups according to subject. So the curriculum was narrower because parents were paying for classrooms and there were not sufficient classrooms. So this spun out across the system. But it was not only the number of classrooms that was affected, it was also the quality. Parents were faced with, spending more money on fewer classrooms or stretching that money as much as they could to build as more classrooms, but in the process, building them more cheaply. So this meant that the quality of schools and school buildings was not good. It meant that specialized facilities such as science labs or art rooms or libraries or staff rooms were seldom, if ever, built at all. And it also meant that it was really difficult to offer these subjects and to teach them if they were offered. For example, to teach science or art without an art room or a science lab. It meant that many schools did not have storage facilities or shelves or cupboards for books and equipment. I did actually teach in such a school for a while, and my classroom cupboard was the boot of my car. I would park my car in front of my classroom door, and every time I needed a book, or wanted to pull out some material that I'd had for the students, I would walk out the door, down the steps to my boot, open the boot, take out what I needed and bring it back. There was no cupboard. I don't mean even a lockable cupboard. I mean, there was no cupboard at all in the classroom. And this was common. It also meant that teachers were not really keen to work in these circumstances, particularly, for example, art or science teachers. These schools were not comfortable places to be. And often that meant that the least qualified teachers worked in these schools, because teachers tended to go towards the schools which were more comfortable to teach in. And that's completely understandable. I think most teachers do exactly that today. They get jobs in the schools where they feel they can get on with teaching. I don't think that that has changed. This system of funding also affected where classrooms and schools were built, and how they were distributed. So, for example, parents wanted their youngest children not to walk a long way to school, and so they often spent money first on the classes of the lower grades. And the classes for the higher grades were often not built at all in these rural areas. So when kids got older, they either had to go a lot further to get to school, maybe try and go to the nearest town to get into a school, and often they didn't succeed in doing that. So a lot of kids left school a lot earlier because of this arrangement. They simply were not enough classrooms at the higher levels, and the dropout rates were very high. This system of funding also meant that schools were quite politicized in terms of how they were organized. So traditional authorities could decide, because they controlled the land, where schools could be built. Traditional authorities, like everybody else, are very varied. Some were people, in fact, there are still traditional authorities. So I guess some are people who have the best interests of the whole community at heart, and others were pursuing their own personal political ambitions. So, for example, they would want a school built near the village that supported them, to reward that village and to encourage other villages to support them. So the provision of schooling got all tangled up in these ways with local politics. And obviously, at the end of the day, I think it will be clear to you that all of this affected the quality of teaching. It contributed to high dropout rates. It contributed to high failure rates. Often boys tended to drop out more and sooner than did girls, because they saw perhaps the possibility of finding some kind of work, and that was preferable to repeating classes, if at all they could find themselves in classes. So this was not a very comfortable picture. I've said some things about teachers, but the education of teachers, what we used to call the training of teachers or the preparation of teachers, was also different in these areas. In the earlier apartheid years, in fact, you could leave ordinary school at the end of what was then standard 8, what is now grade 10, and go and do, I think it was 2 years to become a teacher. So you would leave as a teacher when other kids were leaving school. So this did not make for very highly sophisticated teacher preparation. And towards the end of apartheid, when in fact the system had ended and most teachers had finished school before doing teacher training, even by then, many of these teachers who'd been trained in this way, that is, leaving school early and going into colleges, they were still there, they were still in the system. And so teacher training colleges were in many ways just a specialized form of high school. They were not what we think of today as forms of teacher education. So all of these things that I've been describing to you, I would call a state-aided system. So what happened after 1994? Of course, there were some very real changes. The Bantustans were dissolved. They were incorporated into the provinces. Officially, the same policies began to apply to all schools, regardless of race and place. And this meant that officially, public schools would be provided to whoever needed them, and they would be of similar quality, and teachers would be drawn from the same pool. However, we do not see this promised equitable schooling system even today. This is not, in fact, what happened. Instead, there have been a number of big research projects and also some work that I've done that has shown that actually in many ways, many schools in the rural areas in the former Bantustans are today much as they were before 1994. There are still too few teachers, there are still big class sizes, there are still inadequate facilities and resources. The curriculum is still constrained. The conditions of work for teachers are still really uncomfortable. And recent work has shown that the funding of basic education has in general in the last few years been declining. So funding has not been made available to address and to change these conditions that were already put in place before 1994. Equal Education is one of the organizations that has shown us how infrastructure budgets are not being spent, and how, in fact, very little money has been spent on infrastructure. So these basic material conditions of schooling have not really been addressed. So we find ourselves still with schooling organized very inequitably along mutually reinforcing lines of class, place, and race. But the irony, in a way, is that it's not only what has not changed, which has led to this continuing inequality, it is also what has changed. And what has changed, ironically, is that an old state-aided system, which we had only in the former Bantustans, has been replaced by a new state-aided system of funding across the country as a whole. And that new state-aided system is basically a fee-based system. So what that means in effect is that the bulk of school spending is spent on teacher salaries. Very little is spent on anything else. Very little is provided to redress the inequalities of the past. Ironically, it's the rich now who have the most obvious form of a state-aided system. In fact, it is they who have to pay additional costs through fees, not have to, but have the opportunity to pay for additional costs, additional facilities, additional teachers through the fees that they pay. This might sound like a good thing until we examine what it means in practice. What it means in practice, that the state is not really providing anything other than teacher salaries for either rich or poor, but the rich have the opportunity to provide this for themselves, as well as the extra teachers, while the poor, especially in the former Bantustan areas, where provision have been so minimal and has consequently been further run down, nothing is added for them, and they are not in a position to supplement spending themselves. So schooling becomes very much like any market. You get the schooling you pay for. If you in a fee-paying school, you pay low fees or you pay high fees, and the supplementation that brings gives you extra luxury, extra opportunity, not necessarily luxury, that's the wrong word, but certainly extra provision and extra teachers, and And if you're at the bottom of the pile, you're almost like people who don't get to buy your own food at all. You're standing in the queue for free nutrition, but you certainly can't top it up with any kind of extras. Of course, the state will tell you that they do build sub-schools, although the evidence has shown, and there have been studies to show this, that this is far from adequate. But where schools are built or renovated, or classrooms are built, or equipment is provided, or any kind of additional spending is done, the way this has been reconfigured since 1994 is that it has been done through parastatals or outside providers, people who we might call that word's slipping over my tongue, but entrepreneurs who get the work by tender, and the official term is implementing agents. So this system is used. If you've been following the story of the provision of PPEs recently to schools, you'll find that there have been huge problems with this provision because outside providers are brought in this way. What does this mean in practice? That, well, for the state, the argument is that this is a way of building local economies, which up to a point sounds fairly reasonable. But in fact, what it means is school provision for the poor has become a vehicle for private profit. And as it happens, not a very efficient one at that. So to reach some conclusions and to return to our initial questions. How did we get to this point? How come inequalities in schools are as great as ever? Firstly, because what was in place before 1994 has not been unraveled. Secondly, because layered on top of this, after 1994, have been approaches to providing schooling, which I suppose we can glibly call neoliberal and neo-capitalist, borrowed from abroad, borrowed from developments in the 80s throughout the world, throughout especially the Western world, which have modeled the way schooling is provided on the market. So yes, communities get the schools they can afford, just as they get clothes and food that they can afford. And private providers see this as a vehicle for making profit. This has been the case partly because policies that are in place have not been implemented. Policies that are intended to redress what was in place before have not been implemented. For example, new schools, new classrooms, and so on have not been built and renovated. And part of the reason for this is that people who live in those areas do not have a voice. They are out of sight. They are not visible. They are not seen. They are not heard. So finally, what needs to change? And how does this link back to COVID? A just reopening of schools, I am suggesting, means moving forward with a developing understanding of what has gone wrong, what needs to change, and what practical steps we need to take. What I've outlined here is that just one of these steps, just part of it, but I think a very central part of it, is to imagine a schooling system which is truly public. That means a schooling system where taxes are used to provide an adequate quality of schooling for everyone. This means a complete revision of the current system of funding for all aspects of schooling, from buildings to teachers to facilities to even PPEs and water tanks. COVID has begun to shine a light on who has been left out and the ways in which they've been left out. Change will not happen if those who have been left out are not seen and heard and present and participating centrally in the process of reimagining schools and creating pressure for change. But I think it's up to all of the rest of us to be part of that as well. Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you, Heather. That was such a great speech, and you've taken us again back into the whole discussion around race, class, public and private interest. And I, at this moment, want to bring you all back onto screen so that we can talk a little bit more and discuss some of what's been said. So I think a lot of the questions which I had in mind prior to this talk, you've answered already. But I'm just thinking in terms of some of the students who are watching. I know I've got some high school students who are watching this evening. And the title of the talk is about disposable youth, and I want to read just a little quote from Henry Giroux's work where it says it's a set of ideas and practices characterized by a ruthless indifference to human suffering, whereby the most brutalizing forces of capitalism are unleashed on individuals and communities who are increasingly denied the protections of the social state. And I think in both of your presentations, you've dealt with this in very kind of deep ways that draw on context and history. The question maybe for when I'm thinking with my students in mind is the question is who benefits from all of this? So when youth are positioned in this way as in need of containment or correction or cure, or when they are positioned as disposable, Heather, you also explained how the poor are being dispossessed of an education through systems of underfunding in schools. Who benefits in this is the question.
Heather, you want to go first? Okay. Who benefits? Look, I don't think it's a zero-sum game where we can explain in some kind of conspiracy theory that that people benefit in tangible ways when youth are become marginalized. It's tied to our whole understanding of social reproduction and how social reproduction works within the modern state over a period of time. Under the many people refer to social reproduction under apartheid in very particular ways, and it did operate in relation to different race groups in very different ways. But it was a modern education system, and it was bound up in a social democratic modern state idea. And fundamental to that idea was that youth needed to be rehabilitated so that they could play a particular role within the economy, whatever that may be. Right? And we were operating in a system whereby in a sense, low-cost labor had a role to play within that system. So the state had an interest in rehabilitating youth in ways that allowed them to then enter the labor market and play a meaningful role. But with the move towards a neoliberal imagination, there is no longer a need. Kids can't find jobs anymore. Unemployment is rife. There are no jobs to rehabilitate them into. And so the neoliberal imagination is such that spending money on these kids is a waste of money because there's no jobs to give them. And so what we need to do, in the past we had warehouses, we warehouse them and we basically try to contain them, and then the good ones we could push back into the labor market. But right now, as my story would tell you, I looked at the periphery of the marginalized, and that is the delinquent youth. But what I would argue is that in the neoliberal imagination, delinquent youth have moved from the periphery into the center. And so all youth on the Cape Flats are envisioned as having no role to play. So who benefits from this? The state does. But the state does not, sorry, not the state. the reorganized state, and a state that has no real role to play other than to contain a public learner population, because it has a particular relationship to industry. Industry can't employ them, and so what the idea is, then you only invest in learners that can become part of a knowledge economy. And we know most kids, for instance, on the Cape Flats, cannot partake in that knowledge economy, and so therefore they can be left to their own devices. I think what the main issue that you're asking, Ashley, is who benefits. The industry benefits, of course, under neoliberalism, but the industry needs the state to continue providing a form of warehousing in the mainstream in order to keep social order in place.
You use the word called reproduction, and again, I'm thinking of my students. Would one of you like to explain the term reproduction? What is meant by that word?
I'll leave it to you, this.
Well, I know there are other people online who've been thinking about this recently. It is, I mean, simply put, when you think about the economy, there are people who produce, for example, they make shoes, but behind them are whole groups of people and also systems that make sure that those people can continue eating and can continue making the shoes. And so schools are one of those. Schools reproduce the system. They make sure that there are people coming out of the system who can then produce and make schools. I don't know, Azeem, if you'd like to pick up from there, but I think that's a useful starting point.
Yeah.
Families also reproduce by supporting. So you have, families where, I don't know, when I was a child, mothers would often not be working because they were working so hard at making sure that, the rest of the family, children could come up and enter the economy. Partners, husbands could, be supported in their role in the economy. That doesn't work in exactly the same way today, but I'm not sure that we're necessarily sitting with a better situation, but it does work differently. But yes, families, schools, and so forth reproduce those and make sure that they're eating and they're educated and ready to come into the market, come into the economy and produce.
Yeah.
Thank you. Alwyn, you had a question?
It wasn't a question. I just wanted to kind of make the link with this evocative image that Heather offered us of the apron, because I think also we need to acknowledge in the context of South Africa that there's this whole kind of strata that's holding everyone else up, which is of domestic labor. And all of a sudden, even now, if we think about the moment of lockdown, suddenly people have become much more aware of actually what goes into that whole subsystem of domestic labor, where certain people in South Africa were looking after the welfare of others to continue their economic productivity. So in that sense, it's also this kind of question of social reproduction.
Yeah.
Thank you both for those wonderful talks.
Yeah, thank you. This morning, there were pickets on the Prince George Drive M5 here in Cape Town, and teachers were outside obviously responding to issues related to schooling and the reopening of schools, also saying that schools are inadequately equipped. And I think what you've presented has been so helpful to show that actually, because Azeem, your study, I think is dated 1937 to 1968, and Heather's work on Bantustans is also from an earlier period than what we're experiencing now. And for a lot of young people maybe that watch this, we sometimes get this in our workshops with the students, but isn't that just about history or about the past? But to actually see how these things are playing out now and how they remain relevant today. The continuities, but also the discontinuities. I want to switch though to some questions that we had from the Facebook feed, and there was a question from Neville Goliath, and it was, do we lead into this new normal with policy or by introducing programs for change, practice, or is it structural change that is needed? So I'll put the question up there if you want to take a look at it.
Let me deal with that question, Ashley. Look, the challenge is, you know what before March 2020, in my classes, I was pushing a strong line where I noted the increasing move of the private into the public space, and the privatization of social services like residential care. Busasa basically is a security protection organization. You know the corruption behind Busasa, but most of the residential care institutions in South Africa have been placed under the care of Busasa, so they're private providers. So until March 2020, I had this idea that we are increasingly moving towards a world in which the private is the norm. But what has shocked us since COVID has hit is the need of the state to keep people in large institutions. There's still a need for some kind of large institution in order to deal with the needs of the marginalized and the previously oppressed in this country. So we've gone back to, in a sense, a need for the state and for the need for the public. And so there's now suddenly we need to start thinking about how's that impacted upon our imagination. Now, I think Neville, the question that Neville's asking is partly tied to something that has happened in the Western Cape over the past 2 years, and that is the need to deal with discipline in schools by creating a one-stop warehouse where we take all kids that need to be disciplined out of school and place them in one institution. And the question in terms of pedagogy or in terms of practice is, do we treat them in this one institution, or do we rather go off and create little interventions, small, meaningful interventions in schools? That is obviously a much more expensive exercise. And this is really all about money. We only go for large institutions when we want to save money. And these smaller kinds of interventions are obviously more meaningful, but they also cost a lot more. And I think that's fundamentally what we are going to be challenged with moving forward, is how the state is going to rethink whether it goes the increasingly privatized route, or it's going to return to a much cheaper model, and that is larger institutions. Because in order to get out of COVID, they are going to have to also try to get to deal with a larger number of people. And when they do that, they might have to go for the large institution again. And so there's this dilemma they're going to have. But here's the problem. When young people are criminalized, commodified, demonized, individualized, medicalized, stereotyped, and victimized by systems of repression and disposability, then a state system will always just simply say that it's going to be too costly. When you use that kind of languages, so what Neville's asking is one or the other. I would argue we have to take a step further back. We have to change the languages that inform which route we choose, because it's in the languages that becomes an important thing. There's there's a codification that had happened within the education and the other social services system, whether it be health or other systems. There's a codification that certain kinds of people are lazy, certain kinds of people are uneducated, certain kinds of people are unskilled or unemployable, and it's how we change that language that I think Neville needs to, in a sense, speak to.
Yeah, perhaps I can add something there, shall I? So, yeah, programs or policies or what kinds of interventions. Yeah, find what Azeem says about language very evocative, and I think that is an important part of it. But in a way, for me, programs, projects, interventions are all means, and which means one picks up it's got to do with what end one is trying to achieve. So for me, the end is to imagine something different, to imagine things being different, which includes a different language and a different way of speaking about who we are and where we want to go. And then putting pressure on policy, putting pressure on implementation, not going the policy route, coming up with programs, coming up with interventions, coming up with programs of resistance. I think these are means to an end, but it's very difficult to say which route we're going to take until we first talk about where we want to arrive.
Thank you, Heather. I think a similar question from Kurt Minar, and Kurt is a teacher in the Mitchell's Plain area, but also around this idea of how does a school teacher or teachers begin to educate and draw in the community with the goal of getting them to mobilize and put pressure on the state to provide the funds needed to bring about the change desired. And I wonder if that question is also a question about cultivating a different imagination, or how you would come at, how would you respond to Kurt teaching in Mitchell's Plain?
Azeem, go. The inside perspective.
You're muted, Azeem.
Whenever I speak about the historical structures that are in place, and I tell my story about how social reproduction has happened over time, how relationships between different communities and their relation to schools, institutions, and other kinds of institutions, how that network of relationships get reproduced over time. And so part of 94 was that we needed to break many of them, and we did. We broke the links between these various networks of relationships, so that social reproduction, as happened in the past, was not reproduced in the same way. But there are lots of the racialized reproduction that continued, because those racialized reproduction happened within those other. They basically just moved their face. It was no longer black people. It was bodies that lived in a particular geographical space. And so you could take away their color, but you could not take away their marginality. And we were not able to interrupt that. So Kurt will ask the question about Mitchell's Plain. Through all my work, I work with boys on a weekly basis, and boys shock me on a daily basis. They shock me with the kinds of things they're able to do. They have agency, but when they have agency, they have a mocking kind of agency. They mock us. There's something I always write. Is a line that I use. I'm just looking for the line where youth understand that just gonna look for that line quickly. Sorry, I found it. So youth know about their future, but the minute they also tell you about their future, they also know that their future is already decayed. It's the image I always bring up. The youth of our current era know that whatever future you speak about has already decayed by the time they get there. So it's like a piece of bread that gets left out for them. And the minute they get there, then they find it's got mold all over. And our youth mock us because they know that that's their reality. And that you want them to play the game, they'll play it. But they'll play it in a very mocking way, knowing that they need to find a different route and a different way of engaging. So in relation to Kurt, the point I'm trying to make is our kids operate with agency, but bound up by structure, and they know it.
Alwyn.
Thank you. I'm going to kind of use one of the terms that Azeem was using before, and also that came through very beautifully in what Heather was saying about the ways in which these things are storied and how these narratives kind of wash over us. I think perhaps the mockingness that you're talking about right now is not so much a fixed tactic, but it's a tactic of survival. It's that assumption that the bread will be moldy in the future, and the fear perhaps that we will not be able to change that assumption or that outcome. But I don't think we should reproduce simply the fact of the mocking as being a problem, because I think that is a welcome tactic that speaks to me of survival, and also of a usefulness of kind of navigating those difficulties through playfulness. And I'll pause there.
If I may, actually, I think the point I was trying to make was that there's a summons to inventiveness that is required in these multiple settings. There's these multiple constraints, but these kids know that they need to be inventive. And so I think that's what we need to start tapping into, is this: how do they become inventive in this space?
I think I'm learning a lot from the discussion, and I think we're beginning to theorize about modes of resistance. It reminds me of Paul Willis's work in Learning to Labor, and the story of the lads who resist in particular ways that might be described as self-defeating. So they recognize that they're in trouble. They resist the system, they resist the oppression, but the ways in which that resistance takes shape and take form still ends up reproducing rather than transforming the system itself. And I think possibly in later sessions of this webinar series, we need to look and explore more deeply about how we think about resistance. I want to pick up on a different question, and that's from one of the viewers. It's Juliet Paulser, and she asks, so where does democracy fit into a reorganized state within neoliberalism? Where then do the youth fit as citizens?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just take one little strand into that, and maybe the rest of you and all three of you can pick up from there. I mean, for me, democracy is in the first instance about imagining together, deliberating together. I mean, I'm sure that very few people who are watching and participating in this think of democracy as just, for example, voting. But we need to say, well, if it's not voting, I mean, that's part of it, of course, but what more is it? And it's the process of entering into, as we said, imagining where we want to go, what kind of life we want, what kind of world we want, and how to get there. And I think, that's something that is quite literally part, or should be part, of education.
Thank you, Heather. The backdrop to a lot of what we are doing, the reason why we're doing this online and not doing this in a physical space or venue is because of COVID-19 and being on lockdown. And I want to kind of bring that in a little bit. I know that both of you have addressed this somewhat in your presentations, but just to bring that up again. So in light of contemporary debates about schooling during COVID-19, what do you think a just opening of schools might mean for youth who are positioned on the margins and at the back of the field? So for these youth who are being positioned by these social institutions in this way, as in need of correction and cure and homogenized in the way that they are, what does a just opening of schools look like in this moment of COVID-19?
The opening of schools is not going to be just, but it might be part of a conversation towards justice. And I hope that it will be that. I think what we have seen, Azeem, for example, spoke about the public and the private. And certainly internationally around social provision, this debate around the public and the private has shifted dramatically during the COVID period. People who were great supporters of private provision, of health, of education, of social provision, have suddenly become great supporters of some kind of greater public role in regulating and providing, especially health, but not only health. I think it can be a platform towards justice. It's not going to be just, but it can be a platform from which we can move towards greater justice. Maybe Azeem is more optimistic.
I'm actually less optimistic, sorry. Look, my take on, I think it's the wrong question we're asking. I think this connection between whether school should open or close and inequality, I think it's a game we've already lost. But I think it's important that we have a debate about why schools should not open, and why they should open at the same time. I'll tell you why I think they should open at the same time and not in the staggered way as we have it. Whether you open the schools now for the working classes won't really matter. They are going to fail, and they're not going to be able to enter the system, whether it be universities, colleges, whatever else they're going to do. They're not going to be able to do that next year, whatever we do. They're too far behind. The ex-Model C schools have done what they needed to do online, and they might still be able to save their group of students to get into wherever they need to be. So whether the pragmatic approach that the state is taking is that why hold one back when the other one's already lost, and that's their position. And so the question that we have to ask is not whether we want to equalize them, but what are the losses that we make in terms of democracy and social justice, and how we think about equality. What do we lose in that discourse if we allow them to have staggered openings? And I think that's where the debate really lies. Is not whether we want to equalize them or not, but can we afford to have a schooling system open for the rich and a schooling system to remain closed for the poor? In our political discourse, in our understanding of democracy, can we afford that? Because it will disrupt how we think about democracy itself.
Thank you, Azeem and Heather. Heather, when you mention the terms public and private, For some of my students, I think you need to give some more clarity on what you mean by this, because for many of them, they might understand themselves as being part of a public education system by attending a public school. But at the same time, we also see public schools charging all sorts of different kinds of school fees. We also see schools now going on to things like Backer Buddy, to fund teachers or to fund fixing of the school toilets. So what is meant by a public schooling system?
Okay, so at one level, we don't have any kind of public schooling system in that we don't have a properly resourced, we don't have properly and adequately resourced schools where the resources are coming not from the parents, but from the state. But insofar as we have anything like a public system, we do have schools where what they do have comes from the states, and those are the non-fee paying schools. As far as I'm concerned, every fee paying school is state aided or semi-private. And the higher the fees, the closer they are to being effectively private. But of course, even poor schools can be privatized. And we've seen moves towards that recently. I would argue that the recent collaboration schools were a move towards privatization of poor schools, by which I mean that not that fees were being paid by the students, but that profit was being made from providing schooling to the students. So it's a very complicated picture, but what we do not have in this country at the moment is any kind of a public system that is an adequate system that is provided for all from some sort of shared resources, which basically are taxes.
Thank you so much. I don't see any further questions in our comment section, and I think maybe that is a good note to kind of begin to draw our conversation to a close. I'm going to say, Alwyn, Azeem, and Heather, if you maybe each of you have a closing remark to make.
Okay, I'll jump in on that invitation. Thank you so much, Ashley. I think it's been an amazingly rich conversation. I've certainly got a lot of things I want to go back and look at again. And also very nice engagement from our viewers. I'm just going to leave with a few lines from a story that we got through from one of our participants when we threw out the term disposable youth. I won't read all of it because it's a beautiful, rich one, but that person says, "When I think of disposable youth, I think of us, learners going to school in the midst of it all. I think of us getting educated, but we still can't escape poverty. I think of a grade 8 class with over 200 learners as ending as under 80 in matric." And then using lots of amazingly descriptive sensations that they have. I think your discussion this evening has really made the case in a way for the significance of imagination, the significance of understanding connectedness across time, and with the legacies of infrastructures and forgetting, but also to think really thoughtfully and practically about how we build our way out of these conditions and these systems. Thank you so much, both of you.
Maybe I should go first, and then I want to make 3 points. The first point I want to highlight is the imagery that remains in our heads, especially in education, this puritanical insistence on original innocence, and how it's been threaded through a sinful, polluted African colored body, and how the idea of sinfulness and pollutedness has lingered in terms of how we approach educational and moral decline. Those images that hold our education system up in a particular way that has also been used to close down our public services. pollutedness, inefficiency, and sinfulness that happens attached to that, tied to our president, our previous president, and corruption as well. So this whole imagery, I think we need to just hold on to because it's locked into our own imaginations about why kids do well in school and which kids do well in school. It's this whole pollutedness of race that lies there, but we don't actually engage with it. It's in the background somewhere. Then the second point I wanted to make is that we need to learn from our young people. The two things that hold them in place all the time is recollections of loss, because all of them have loss, and recollections of abandonment. And they operate with these two concepts all the time, loss and abandonment, when they engage, when they imagine, when they coalesce, and they interact with political, sociological, historical, and schooling systems. They imagine their lives in relation to this. If we don't pick up on that, then we don't understand what happens when we get those little explosions in schools. We need to understand those explosions in relation to where they come from and how they engage with these kinds of things. And then the last point that I wanted to make was tied to the video. You know, the last slide in my slideshow was a video whereby we had at Ottery a marimba band that came from Masabambani, a African, predominantly a school in Kuils River that has a predominantly African population, if you want to put it that way. And our idea in getting them to come and play the marimba and be part of an opening of one of our events was to connect the idea of delinquent boys and these marimba bands. They came there, they played, they went to have lunch together, they ate together. They after lunch, they went back and they taught the marimba band, was teaching the young boys how to play, and they were taking them around the institution, and we started breaking down the boundaries that had been created over time around race, about delinquency, about the polluted body, about music, and about how human beings interact. It's in our practice, and that's when coming back to Kurt's question: how we change the world of these kids is how we change their practices and how they engage with the individual worlds.
Thanks, Azeem. Yeah, perhaps I want to end with a question that I avoided earlier because I found it very difficult to answer without being totally glib and unhelpfully so. And that is the question about who benefits. So at one level, it's an easy question to answer. When you have an unequal system, it's a little bit like two people both wanting an apple standing on a tree, but one is taller, and the taller one's always going to get the apple. The taller one benefits because of advantages. So at one level, the schooling system is a bit like that. You know, some kids are put in a position where they get the goodies, they get the apples, and others don't, just because of where they find themselves standing. But for me, while that is true, there's two more levels around that, which I think we should take quite seriously. I was reading something in the week, which is not yet published, but which reminded me of how a very greedy system, political and economic system, ultimately eats its own tail. So, for example, the schooling system is completely undermined by greed and by not being properly looked after, not being adequately provided for, to the point where the whole economy ultimately will suffer because the schools won't produce the kinds of people that economy requires. So in a way, when people, keep reaching for the apples and eating it themselves, ultimately, they themselves will also lose out, But I think the thing that I finally come back to is the way in which we all lose out from a system that is dehumanized and alienating. no matter who we are, no matter whether we're the ones getting the apples or the ones not getting the apples. There's an alienation in this kind of social injustice that damages every single one of us. And at some point, we have to, I think, nobody really benefits. We're just too blind to see how we're damaging ourselves.
Sure. I'm left with a lot of food for thought this evening. Thank you so much, Heather and Azeem, for sharing with us and for allowing us into your own experiences and sharing with us your research and helping us to think through what's happening in contemporary society in a sociological, historical manner. Also, thank you to the viewers who have tuned in. We apologize for some of the technical issues we had that we couldn't show the video Azeem wanted to show. But we're really thankful that you have joined in for the conversation. And just to say, this Imagining Otherwise webinar series will continue. We aim to try to do a session every 2 weeks. And so just check in on the website or Twitter, and we will share updates about when next a session will be live. Thank you so much for joining us. Keep well.
Thank you,
and
Ashley.
good evening.
Good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.